Welcome. My name is James Syke. I'm an Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this week. It pretty much is every week, isn't it, at the moment? Seminar speaker, Roman Krznaric. Pronounced that pretty well, didn't I?
Perfectly pronounced.
Did.
Say every letter without fear.
That's it. You've just got to leap into the consonants. Krznaric, Roman Krznaric. So Roman is going to be talking about his seventh book, and I actually have some biographical text here. Let me just read this to you. Rome's a social philosopher. He writes about the power of ideas to create change. His previous best-selling books include The Good Ancestor, Empathy, The Wonder Box, and Carpe Diem Regained. These have been published in more than 25 languages. When he's not writing books, he's a senior research fellow at University of Oxford, and
Exeter. I like that.
Right. I was trying to avoid pronouncing the Centre for
Eudaimonia.
Yeah, that one, and Human Flourishing, and founder of the world's first empathy museum.
Yeah.
This latest book, History for Tomorrow, was published last summer, I think July 24. So the plan is that Roman is going to be talking for about 40 minutes, then there's going to be a Q&A, after which there will be opportunities to purchase said books, and even maybe a photo opportunity with the author.
More importantly, the book is at a discount, a mere
discount opportunity.
15 quid instead of 22.
Yeah, that's a hefty discount that he's made available just to the select GSI audience. It's an offer not to be repeated elsewhere, so please do take opportunity of that. Later, Roman's going to be around for the rest of the day, so if you want to have some time with him, let me know and I'll schedule something. And then later this evening, we're going to be, where are we going to be for dinner? Herbie's. We're going to be at Herbie's from 6:30. So if you want to come and continue this afternoon's discussions and have some dinner and lovely vegan lasagna and other things, then please make yourself known to Rafi, who is organising that. But yes, this should be the start of a wonderful conversation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the GSI seminar, Roman Krznaric.
Let me just check I'm switched on. I am switched on. Hello to you all. Nice leap. Well, let us leap, in fact, back 200 years or so to the mid-18th century. So imagine you're standing on the old wooden Nihonbashi Bridge in the ancient Japanese city of Edo, now known as Tokyo. So it is around the year 1750. You've got seafood traders rushing across to the fish market, laborers pushing cartloads of rice, people chatting to their friends. Now, Edo was remarkable not just for being a huge city of over 1 million people, far larger than London or Paris at the time, but it also operated what we would today call a circular economy, where almost everything was reused, repaired, refurbished, or recycled. So partly because at the time, Japan wasn't trading much with the outside world, there were shortages of precious resources like wood and cotton. So for instance, the tradition of patchwork developed, known as boro, meaning tattered rags where fragments of old cotton cloth were sewn together into garments, which were then passed on down the generations, just like the one I'm wearing here, which is over 100 years old. So this is a traditional boro jacket, if I just twist and turn. So you might also have a kimono. And when the cloth began to wear out, you might turn it into pajamas that you'd wear at night. Then you'd cut up the cloth and turn it into nappies. Then you'd use it as cleaning cloths, and you'd finally burn it as fuel. There were thousands of, why is my clicker working here?
Another thing, Roman, is why isn't working really well for people online?
Okay, what if I stand here? Is that better for people online? Do we know? That's working? Yeah?
Okay, seems okay.
Okay, it seems okay. I'll try not to move around too much. So there were thousands of circular businesses in Edo in the 18th century. So there were people who would collect used candle wax strippings to reform into candles, or down and out samurai would be repairing old umbrellas. Traders would even pay for your human waste, which they would then sell on as agricultural fertilizer. And because Japan had cut down much of their old growth forests. There was a huge reforestation program and rationing of timber to restore those old growth forests. So if you stand back and think about Edo in the 18th century, it was kind of one of the world's first large-scale examples of a low-waste, low-carbon ecological civilization. Now, it was by no means a utopia, of course. It was a feudal society. It was a patriarchal society. But 300 years on, I think it offers hope that we can create economies today that go beyond the addictions of chronic wastefulness and ecological overshoot of consumer capitalism to create deeply sustainable economies. So if we were going to adopt this circular mindset of Edonomics now, we, for example, rapidly phase out the sale of standard smartphones, which, as you know, use over 2/3 of the elements of the periodic table, all those rare earth metals, and are discarded after less than 3 years on average. And instead, we'd introduce regenerative standards. So the only phones available for sale would have recycled materials and be modular by design, which I think would be pretty good. I mean, a bit like a Dutch Fairphone. Does anybody have a Fairphone here? One Fairphone owner. And do you love it? Yeah. Slight pause, but there we are. And you know, this kind of, having that kind of world doesn't require a military dictatorship like existed in Edo, Japan. It just requires smart regulation. I mean, in the same way that, you know, cities like Paris or Amsterdam are saying, you know, no fossil fuel cars in 2030 going through the cities, and companies are adjusting. You could easily be doing the same for phones and a whole load of other products. So I think Japan offers hope for a different kind of a circular possibility. But I think what's also interesting thing about Japan is that it managed to combine radical sustainability with cultural flourishing. So it gave birth, Edo Japan, to the artworks of Hiroshige, to the poetry of Basho, and to a thriving culture of sumo wrestling, which looks pretty good, I think. So I think Edo, well, look, why am I telling you about Edo, actually? Why am I telling you about this? Because I think it's one amongst many really good illustrations of the way that history offers unexpected insights and inspiration for thinking about the future of humanity. I mean, we have vast amounts of the stuff to tap into, layer upon layer of it. And history, I think of as something that is more, that can kind of, rather than help us sort of predict the future, rather it can help us sort of navigate the future. It's a counselor rather than a clairvoyant. But of course, the reason I've partly written this book, History for Tomorrow, is out of a kind of frustration with the way that our politicians and policymakers are so trapped in the tyranny of the now, you know, with their eyes on the next election or the latest opinion poll, or crossing their fingers and hoping that new technologies will sort out all our problems for us. And I think what they're failing to tap into is to recognize that in order to go forward, sometimes you need to look backwards. I mean, you'd never drive a car without looking in the rear vision mirror. Now, the idea, of course, of learning from history is far from new. You can go back to the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, or the German writer Goethe, who said, "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living from hand to mouth." And I love that idea of history being full of nourishment. But normally, when we think about learning from history, we're thinking about learning from the warnings, captured in that famous aphorism that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And while I think it's important to learn from the warnings, from the history of colonialism and totalitarianism, for instance, I think we also need to learn from what's gone right as much as what's gone wrong, because time and again, human societies have risen up to tackle injustices, to overcome crises, to build cities and civilizations. Historically, social innovation has been just as important as technological innovation for enabling societies to transform. And so what I've done in this book, History for Tomorrow, is I've taken 10 major challenges facing humanity this century: climate crisis, hyper-consumerism, threats to democracy, risks from AI, genetic engineering, and so on, and asked, what can we learn from the last 1,000 years of history to help us tackle those issues in more innovative or effective ways, and trying to draw on what's gone right as much as what's gone wrong. So I've given you kind of one example of Edo, Japan, which I think tells us a story about how there are alternatives to consumer capitalism. But let me share with you a few more. One of them is the idea that we can prevail over me. So there's this historian from the 14th century who you may have read called Ibn Khaldun, North African historian. He wrote a book called the Muqaddimah. And if you read the Muqaddimah, there is a word that is mentioned more than 500 times. It's this, asabiya. Asabiya, an Arabic word meaning collective solidarity or group feeling. And Ibn Khaldun believed that he wrote a kind of book on the rise and fall of civilizations. It's one of the first great texts in historical sociology. And he basically argued that what would explain the rise and fall of civilizations was the presence or absence of asabiya, this kind of social trust, a social glue. So when asabiya was eroded, for example, by wealth inequality, then your civilization would probably fall apart. And I think it's very relevant today in our age of sort of hyper social polarizations, partly generated by social media, as we're becoming increasingly fragmented, whether it's climate change activists, climate change deniers, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, whatever it is, to think about how do we create the we, the asabiya that holds our societies together. And if you're thinking about the impacts of, say, social media polarization, where we get caught in those algorithms which keep feeding us those news feeds which reinforce our existing views, where can we learn historically about that? And I think one of the places to learn is by looking back at another communications technology which emerged 500 years before social media, but which is very important in helping us understand this, which is, of course, the printing press, or the mechanical printing press, particularly invented in Germany in the 15th century. Now, I think the real story of the printing press begins in the year 1517 with this, what I have in my hand here, which is the world's first viral blog post. I'm sure some of you will know what I'm holding up here. What am I holding up here? Yes, Luther's tracts. These are Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformer's 95 Theses, which he published in the year 1517. They were nailed to a church door in Wittenberg in Germany, Castle Door. And the amazing thing about, he originally wrote his critiques of the Catholic Church about the church's corruption and the sale of indulgences and all this kind of thing. He wrote it in Latin, he wrote it by hand, but then his friends translated it into German and they printed it. And the 95 Theses spread across the German-speaking lands of Europe like wildfire. Within like 8 weeks, people all across Europe knew about the critiques of the papal hierarchy in Rome. And Luther was a very canny social media operator. He then translated the New Testament into German so that everyday people could read it. You can see on the left-hand side there just the explosion of works by Luther, the number of editions of Luther's work. In fact, in the first 10 years of what became the Reformation, between 1517 and 1527, of the 6 million pamphlets published in German-speaking lands in Europe, 2 million of them were the works of Luther. So absolutely incredible impact. Also, because not everybody could read, a lot of the things that he published, the pamphlets critiquing the church, he had these woodcuts in illustrations so everybody could read it. So what you can see there in the image, the sort of figure with the donkey's head and fish scale skin, is actually a portrait of the Pope from the year 1523. But the point I want to make here is that while the printing press helped spread Luther's work and in many ways helped balance the religious power by enabling Protestants to challenge the Catholic hierarchy, it also helped inflame religious warfare because it enabled exactly that, the Protestants, reformers like Martin Luther and others, to challenge the Catholic Church. And that's why the great historian of printing, Elizabeth Eisenstein, concludes that Gutenberg's invention probably contributed more to destroying Christian concord and inflaming religious warfare than any of the so-called arts of war ever did. In other words, it inflamed polarization like today's social media, right? And it did it in other ways as well. So one of the things that the commercial printers of Germany loved was fake news in the 16th century. And the classic kind of form of fake news that they spread was stories about so-called witches who had connived with the devil, for example, to burn down towns in the Black Forest. So here is an example from the year 1533 of a woman who burnt down a town. She'd had sex with the devil. Apparently, she'd flown on her broomstick with his help to burn down a town, and she was burnt at the stake. It was a complete fake news story. The illustration was fabricated as well. But this story about the Maid of Schiltach was her name. She didn't actually have, no one actually knows what her actual real name was. The Maid of Schiltach spread right across Europe. And this is the kind of fake news of its day. And I remember thinking back in August last summer when there was that fake news story about an apparent immigrant who had, I think, stabbed somebody in Southport or somewhere like that. It was completely fabricated. And even on the street around the corner from where I live in Oxford, there were far-right people being bussed in to come and try and throw rocks at the windows of the refugee resource center, local refugee resource center. I kept thinking this is a kind of return to what was happening in the 16th and 17th century. In Britain, between 1530 and 1680, around 500 people, mostly women, were executed for the crime of witchcraft. In Germany, it was 25,000, and it was the printing presses which was so essential in making that happen. Now, the story of the printing press wasn't all bad, because the printing press then also, in later decades, even centuries, helped spread democratic ideals and human rights ideals. And it did so in combination with another technology, important social technology, called the coffee house. Right? And as you may know, there was an explosion of coffee houses in Europe from the 1650s. They come from Turkey. In London, by 1700, there were around 2,000 of them. And what was quite interesting about them, sort of sociologically, was not just that you could get a cup of coffee for a penny and sit on it all day, but if you walked into them, as you see in the images here, most of them had these communal tables where you would sit down and talk to strangers, and you'll see on the tables pamphlets and periodicals. This is where the printing press came in. You would read stuff, you would talk about it with strangers. It wasn't a complete democratic sort of hive, it was mostly men, mostly educated, but they were called penny universities, the coffee houses, because they were places where people talked and spread radical ideas, often about anti-slavery or republicanism. The great German political philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote his PhD thesis about the coffee houses of London, right? The structural transformation of the public sphere was the book he published on it. So the coffee houses were places of creating democratic culture and citizenship. They were creating kind of asabiya, that Arabic social glue that Ibn Khaldun talked about, in combination with the printing press. And for me, just this history, I think, raises a kind of a question. I think it's fascinating. And it asks the question today, like, in our socially polarized digital worlds today, how do we reforge that asabiya? How do we create the kind of digital coffee house culture of the 18th century, or at least learn from that? Not replicate it as a blueprint, but learn something from it. And I think there's some really interesting examples of this. On the left is an online project called Deutschland spricht, Germany speaks, or My Country Talks, it's sometimes translated as, if you go to the website, My Country Talks. And it's a brilliant project to try and create online conversations between strangers across political divides. It was started by the German newspaper Die Zeit in 2017, big newspaper. And what they did is and they still do it, they put a form online where you could, it's a sort of survey, very basic survey sort of form, to work out what your political position is. And then what they did is they started matching people up with opposite political views to have online conversations on a very simple platform, sometimes face-to-face, but mostly online, on issues like immigration or just general politics. So you match up with your political opposite. Over 100,000 people have now done this Deutschland spricht, and they've now started projects at the EU level in Brazil and other places. But there was this interesting Harvard-Stanford study of it not long ago, which showed that when people are matched up with their political opposite, they stay talking. 90% of people talk for more than 1 hour, and 30% of people speak for more than 2 hours. And the conversations reduce polarization by 78%. Of course, there's lots of debate about how that's measured, but it doesn't get people to radically change their views, but it gets them to be in the same kind of virtual room together and at least have a conversation. So I like that as an example of digital kind of coffee houses. I've also been involved in a lot of projects myself. When I used to be a political scientist, but when I left academia, I started running conversation projects between strangers. And this is one of them, called the Oxford Muse. It was started by a historian called Theodore Zeldin. And I used to organize these meals, conversation meals, where we'd invite people from many different social backgrounds. And we do this in government departments, in towns, cities, universities. And instead of giving people a menu of food, we gave them a menu of conversation, which you can see on the table there with questions about life on it, like, what have you learned about the different varieties of love in your life? Or in what ways would you like to be more courageous? So you'd sort of like the opposite of speed dating. You talk for 2 hours, not for 2 minutes. But I mean, there's lots of these kinds of projects around. But for me, I see them as part of this kind of forging asabiya, that crucial social trust which holds our institutions together, and I think which is a kind of a counter to the polarizations that digital culture has been throwing our way. And I think that history of the printing press helps us take us on a journey to understanding the importance of these kinds of examples. And there are many, many others. So I think, to make my point really, is that I think we can forge new kinds of we. Here's another kind of lesson from history that I take, which is that democracy can be redesigned. This is a topic that, you know, interests me a lot, partly because I just mentioned I used to be a political scientist. I used to teach, you know, undergraduate democracy and stuff. And when I did that, it's like more than 20, 25 years ago, I was incredibly kind of narrow in the way that I thought about democracy. I basically thought democracy was what we have, representative democracy, where you put a little X on the ballot sheet every few years. And what I was kind of extraordinarily ignorant of was the history of democracy, of the different ways, different forms of democratic governance, which you can find across cultures and through history, which I think is so important to think about today when democracy is under so much pressure. I think we're suffering from what you might call democratic fatigue syndrome. We've got massive declines in trust in democratic institutions. You would have maybe come across a survey that came out in January showing that 20% of people in Britain under the age of 45 would be happy with having a strong leader who doesn't have to worry about elections rule them. Of course, and this is part of a pattern, you know, across Europe and in the Americas, etc. And of course, it's not surprising in a sense because democratic representative democracy has been failing to deliver the goods on basics like job security, you know, housing, energy and food prices. And at the same time, of course, we know that these political systems have been chronically failing when it comes to the ecological crisis. That, well, since the alarm bells began to ring in 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit, well, what's happened to global CO2 emissions? You all know, like, they've gone up by more than 50%. So I think we need to be looking at rethinking what democracy looks like, and without having to go down the route of dictatorship. So where can we find inspiration in history? I think, let me just give you a couple of examples. In the 19th century, when British colonial forces went into the lands of Igbo communities in today's Nigeria, they were looking for rulers, for chiefs, and they were frustrated because they couldn't find any. Why? Because Igbo communities ruled themselves through a kind of democratic, grassroots, decentralized form of democracy, where most decisions were made by consensus at the village level, including men and women, and then for larger scale decisions, they would sometimes have delegates or kind of messengers to go up to another level. So it was a bottom-up form of direct or participatory democracy. And this kind of model you can find throughout Western and non-Western history. Go to Switzerland. In the 16th century was the foundation of one of the best kept secrets in the history of democracy called the Free State of Raetia, or the Republic of the Three Leagues, which I had never heard of until about 3 or 4 years ago when I started researching this book. Like, I thought I was an expert on democracy. I so wasn't. So the Free State of Raetia existed for over 2 centuries, and it was a kind of small republic in today's Switzerland, but they basically had something like Igbo communities, right? So they had, most decisions were made in about 250 neighborhood councils. Mostly, it was only men, so it was discriminatory in that way, but it was all men. So, you know, it was, you know, priests and merchants as well as cowherds would be engaged in politics. And they had these 250 neighborhood councils, and then they would then send delegates, not a representative, more like a messenger or an ambassador up to a kind of regional, there was a commune level, 50 communes, and then they had a federal assembly, a Bundestag, which met a couple of times a year. Very successful, not perfect, messy, but it lasted until Napoleon came along and crushed it. Today, in Kurdish-controlled Syria, in the area region called Rojava, they have something similar, where decision-making is made in the first instance in local assemblies or neighborhood assemblies, and then again, delegates are sent up to higher levels. Here, they're particularly influenced by the whole history, actually, of Swiss democracy, ancient Greek democracy, partly because the leader of the PKK, the Kurdish Liberation Movement, when he was in prison, still in prison, read the works of the American anarchist writer Murray Bookchin, the founder of social ecology, who wrote all about the history of democracy. And Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, had a kind of a revelatory moment when he realized that for the Kurdish people, the thing to do was not to try and overthrow the state in Turkey and other places, but to try and reform politics from within with a direct democracy format. So this is one kind of lesson from history. You see this sort of direct grassroots assembly style democracy. Another form of democracy you see is the idea of what we today call sortition, the selection of public officials from the citizenry through a lottery process, which is of course what we have for juries. And this was most famously done in ancient Greece, again, just for male citizens who are non-immigrants and non-slaves. Great book on this by David van Reybrouck, the brilliant Belgian historian, called Against Elections, on the history of sortitions. And of course, as he points out, that many aspects of Athenian democracy, 4th, 5th century BC, had random selection, particularly for basically their parliament, the Council of 500. But this model was then used in Europe in the Renaissance. It was used in Florence, in Republican Florence. It was used in Venice. It was then spread to Spain. It spread to Germany. Random selection of citizens for public office. And of course, today we have it, right, in the Citizens' Assembly movement, which is just a revival of an old democratic tradition. Random selection, of course, now controlled for gender and ethnic background and age and geography. There's me speaking at the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss in Ireland a couple of years ago. And the amazing thing about citizens' assemblies, which I know by no means perfect, I don't think, there's all sorts of problems with them, often because politicians ignore the recommendations they come up with. But I think we're learning to get really good at citizens' assemblies. I mean, East Belgium now has a permanent citizens' assembly. There's a citizens' assembly on the climate in Brussels. And I was just amazed when I gave this talk in Ireland, 100 randomly selected people. By the end of the first day, 1 in 4 of those people had stood up and asked a question to the experts. And on quite a technical subject, biodiversity loss, which had to do with EU law and complex ecosystem stuff. But people were interested and smart and had really great comments and thoughts. And I think it just tells us that we don't need to rely on the experts. Though I do believe in experts. There's all sorts of experts in the room here on various things. But we need to have faith in citizens. And the thing about citizens' assemblies, lots of good research emerging on this, is they tend to take the long view, much longer view than your regular politicians, because they're not caught up in the same short-term cycle. So I think what this history, and of course, I think the citizen assembly movement, and there's been more than 250 of them in OECD countries in the last 15 years, is probably the most important shift in the history of democracy since the extension of the franchise to women in the early 20th century. Of course, we know democracy has also been taken in other directions at the same time, towards the far right, an erosion of basic civil liberties and political liberties, but this is also happening too. So I think this is part of a kind of a historical inspiration sort of being brought into the real world. So I think there's other ways of doing democracy. But let me just mention now a final lesson from history, a final way of thinking about how historical thinking can help us. And this is what I want to say here is about the power of disruptive movements to create system change. Now, there's a very annoying book by a guy called Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveler. And I find it annoying anyway. I do recommend reading. It's an important book. It's an argument about how, basically what he argues, he's a kind of economic historian, and says, you only really get radical transformations in his case, he's talking about kind of wealth equality, when there are cataclysmic events in history, like a war, or a state collapse, or a revolution, or a plague, or something like that. And I remember reading that book and I thought, that's just not right. That we've been able to equalize societies in terms of wealth and in other ways, politically and so on, through the power of disruptive movements. I think I don't want to put too much emphasis on this book, but it was just a sort of starting point for my thinking, that there's a sort of tendency to see radical change in terms of cataclysmic events rather than social innovation and social movement power. And again, back in the 1990s when I did my PhD and stuff in political science, a lot of my focus was on the power of social movements. So I've been sort of following this for many years. And I think it's really important to recognize the power of disruptive movements to create change. Now, maybe like you, I've been frustrated over the last 20 years by, I used to think like, if there were just enough like hurricanes and floods and climate events, that the governments might finally wake up and do something. Well, they don't, right? There's too many reasons for them not to act. So a crisis by itself is not enough generally to create change. Of course, crises sometimes, to support Walter Scheedel, sometimes do make a big difference. Britain introduced rationing in the Second World War, right? It'd be quite hard to introduce rationing today, even though I think we should for certain things. But in researching this book, History for Tomorrow, over the last few years, I've sort of developed a kind of a model of how change happens. I call it the disruption nexus. It's a kind of a three-cornered model. And let me just explain this to you. So I don't believe there are any laws of history in that kind of universal laws in that Marxist sense. But I think there are kind of patterns or rules of thumbs in the same way that Elinor Ostrom's 8 principles for managing the commons are kind of a historical pattern, which doesn't always hold, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. So the disruption nexus model works like this. And it's a model to try and explain what are the conditions under which we can get transformative change of political, social, economic systems. I think you need 3 things. I think you need some kind of crisis, economic, political, so on, like financial crash in 2008 or a melting ice sheet. But as I said, that normally isn't enough by itself. Then you need 2 other things. You need disruptive movements of some kind which amplify the crisis, which shift the Overton window, the set of policies which can be deemed acceptable in the public sphere. And so they make the issue relevant. And then you also need new models. You need visionary ideas, sometimes old ideas, that can help replace the old system. So you need these 3 things to come together. And just to give you an example of this, think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of state socialism in East Germany in 1989. You had the 3 elements in place. You had a crisis in the East German government in the summer of 1989 when they were all at odds with each other, arguing about how to respond to Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms. Then you had the ideas, in this case, quite old ideas about democratic freedoms, freedom of movement. And then you had the disruptive movements, the great uprisings in Leipzig in October 1989. Finally, the series of uprisings which culminated in the breaching of the wall in Berlin in November 1989. So, and remember, there had been lots of protests in East Germany for decades before that against the regime, but none of them has succeeded until these 3 factors of the disruption nexus came together. And you can also look at cases where you don't have all 3 elements. So think about the financial crash in 2008, right? You had the crisis, financial crash. You had the movements, the Occupy movement, boom, in over 900 cities around the world in 81 countries within 8 weeks. But I don't think you really had the alternative economic models to replace the old system enough in the public sphere. So you ended up getting the bankers being bailed out, the old system replaced. What we didn't have were the conversations around things like donut economics or degrowth and well-being and all these modern monetary theory, which I think are much more in the public conversation today compared to back in 2008 to 2010. Let me just say something more now, though, about the importance of disruptive movements, that bottom left-hand corner, because I think this is really fundamental. I want to just tell a story about one example of their importance. So just take your mind back to the 1820s, when over 700,000 enslaved people were working on British-owned sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Now, at that time, the plantation owners, most plantation owners and financiers made remarkably similar arguments to today's fossil fuel executives to defend their actions, right? You can see Tim nodding his head there. So they admitted that slavery was morally questionable, but they argued that they couldn't end it too rapidly without the economy collapsing because the economy was so dependent on slave labor. So instead, they argued that slavery should be phased out gradually over many decades, which of course is precisely the same foot-dragging gradualism we hear from the fossil fuel executives today. Now, at that time, in the 1820s, the abolition movement in the UK was organized around something called the Society for Mitigating and Gradually Abolishing the State of Slavery. So its name said it all, right? It was a highly reformist organization. It published pamphlets, it lobbied government, but it was basically making little headway until a very important event in the year 1831, which was this, the Jamaica Slave Revolt, sometimes called the Baptist War, an uprising of more than 20,000 enslaved workers in Jamaica, which they set fire to more than 200 plantations. Now, the revolt was brutally crushed. But it sent a wave of panic through the British establishment, who concluded that if they didn't grant emancipation, they might lose control of the whole island of Jamaica. So this was a real kind of tipping point kind of event. It rapidly then led to the Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833, which was by no means a perfect piece of legislation. It gave huge reparations to not the slaves, but to the slave owners. And enslaved people stayed on as apprentices, basically indentured labor for several years. But it was a big shift. Without the slave revolt in 1831, it could have taken decades longer for abolition to enter the statute books. This was an example of disruptive movements changing the system, and it is part of a pattern that we see through history. We see it in, the disruption of the suffragettes, campaigning for votes for women, the movement for Indian independence, the civil rights movement in the US. And of course, we're seeing these same patterns today with the disruptive movements in the ecological sphere. But of course, the tragedy is while the disruptive figures of the past, like Emmeline Pankhurst, are celebrated in our children's school history textbooks, their modern equivalents in today's direct action ecological movements are being put in prison. In fact, I just sent a copy of this book to Roger Hallam, one of the co-founders of XR and Just Stop Oil, imprisoned, as you probably know, for 4 or 5 years for basically being on a Zoom call, right? And I think one of the interesting thing about many of these disruptive movements, which have been so important at creating change, is that they have involved what social movement theorists call radical flanks or radical flank theory, which you may well know about this, because I think you've had Andreas Malm here speak, who wrote his book on this, the How to Blow Up a Pipeline. But he was drawing on a long history of literature in social movement theory, saying that basically one of the patterns that we see in transformative change is that you have a moderate movement and a radical movement alongside it to make it successful. So, for example, in the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s, you had a moderate movement around Martin Luther King Jr., doing the sit-ins and so on. And then you had the radical flank, the Black Power movement around Malcolm X, Nation of Islam, Black Panthers. And what the radical flank does, it makes the moderate movement look more palatable by comparison, right? Makes it much more acceptable. And I think we're seeing that in today's climate movement. You've got your mainstream movements, Friends of the Earth and so on. And then you've got Ende Gelände and Just Stop Oil and more radical ones on the side. And I think they're being very effective. And I think the evidence is showing that. So I think what history is telling us here is about going back to the disruption nexus kind of model, is that we need to tap into the new models, the new ideas, but also the disruptive movements to create change. I mean, I have found myself, because of what I've discovered, I like sitting in old libraries, basically reading books, but because of what I've discovered in those libraries, I have found myself on the street sometimes with my teenage daughter, blocking the roads in front of Parliament because of my utter frustration with the government's glacial pace of action on the ecological emergency. I mean, I can't think of a better way to be a good ancestor. I know our actions annoy commuters, but our inaction will infuriate future generations even more. I think it's too late and too risky in a historical sense to leave this crisis to simmer on the low flame of gradualism. And if I just stand back now, just to finish up, if I stand back and look at the historical panorama that I've been studying for this last 1,000 years, over the last few years, it can be incredibly depressing, of course, when you look at the multiple failures of movements for change, dictatorships, genocides, and so on, all through history. And if you look at where we are today, as business as usual, I do think we are on course for ecological and technological self-termination. I think that is where we are heading at business as usual. And I find it very difficult even to sort of say those words. But at the same time, so while I'm not kind of optimistic in a kind of glass half full, everything's going to be all right sense, I am hopeful. And by hope, I mean not a glass half full, everything's going to be okay attitude, but by hope, I mean being committed to the vision, your vision and the values that you hold true to yourself, staying true to those values and vision, even when the odds are against you. Because what I've seen in history is that some of the most successful movements for history were fighting against what seemed like impossible odds. I mean, it's not as if those who were campaigning against colonialism in India thought it was going to be an easy task to overthrow the British Empire. Yet they acted as if change was possible. And those two little words, as if, I think are so important as a lesson from history for inspiring us to recognize that, yeah, the chances may be against you, but we always have to act as if change is possible. I think that is how, with that kind of attitude, we're going to bend rather than break as a civilization. And in order to really tap into that kind of thinking, the hope rather than optimism, I think we can find ultimately inspiration in this beautiful Maori proverb, Hia whakatomori te haere whakamua. I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. And with that, I'd like to stop. So come on, James, jump into the present.
Thank you so much. So we've got questions online, I'm sure. Who's managing the online questions? Okay, and we have questions here. So if you want to ask a question, please put your hand up. Yeah, okay. So, yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. I wanted to go back to your disruption nexus because it's, I've been just starting to study positive social tipping points a little bit more. And so I found like your framework around disruption ideas and like movements really helpful in thinking about that. And I was wondering, like, from your perspective, where does like power sit in that nexus, and or what could, I think you could use that framing to also look at how negative tipping points could happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe just like some of your thoughts on what could that nexus bring?
Yeah. Okay. So let's just say something. Let me say something first about power. So I used to love creating models of power. And it's all this stuff. Dimensions of power and power cubes and this and that, and all my early models had power all over them. And actually, I've stopped doing that. Why? It's sort of complex, but everything is about power. I mean, depending on how you define it. I mean, this is a way of thinking about how you challenge certain kinds of power. Now, you might have different conceptions of power, Foucauldian kind of definition, or this or that, whatever. Fine, we can talk about all of that, but I tend not to have power as an explicit sort of element of the models that I create. And in fact, you'll hardly find the word power in this book, right? But I kind of think it's all about sort of power in a sense. But when it comes to positive, negative, and so on, I think the important thing to recognize about this kind of model is that, of course, any crisis, this is a model sort of about crisis rather than tipping points. So let me say something about that first. What do I want to say about that? I recently read Malcolm Gladwell's recent book, Revenge of the Tipping Point. And the frustration I had with that book, and some of the literature on tipping points, and not all of it by all means, is that sense of, I sort of think the idea of a tipping point works when it comes to socio-political systems. A tipping point idea can help explain things where there are kind of, particularly in the realm of sort of technology and when there are sort of financial metrics like price points, the price of solar and things like that. When it comes to explaining, say, regime change or new policies and things, I don't find a kind of a tipping point way of looking at it so effective, because very often, but not always, tipping point theories are quite reductionist, saying like, this is really Malcolm Gladwell, like there's one threshold which you need to pass, right? And once you've reached that magic, like 1/3 of the population who've moved out of an area, then it changes from being white to African-American or whatever it is, all the things that he writes about. I prefer to think about these moments of crisis, which are a bit more complex, but not too complex. I mean, this is a pretty simple model, right? It could have millions of arrows all over it. But of course, in its simplicity, it's problematic in the sense of what it doesn't show is that any moment of crisis can be taken in multiple directions. So you think about, I don't know, the depression in Europe in the early 1930s. Well, it took some countries in Scandinavia towards social democracy and other ones that accelerated towards fascism in Italy and Germany. Today, we're seeing that same, right? What's happening, you know, the storming of the Capitol in the US, you know, QAnon, the Proud Boys, that kind of moment was a moment where some forces, partly because of the way they can use social media and other technologies to their advantage, are able to use these moments more effectively than other kinds of social groups. So definitely, I think it's not so much a caveat, just a recognition that crises can go in multiple directions. And the question is, who's going to kind of win that struggle at any one moment? Whose movements are more effective? Whose ideas are more salient? Even though both sides, as it were, might be responding to the same moment of crisis. Yeah, and I'd say one other sort of general caveat with this kind of model is you can have all three elements of it and still you don't get the change. I mean, think about, say, the US. I just watched the new Bob Dylan film. And I was, you know, thinking about how, you know, in the US in the late 1960s, you had, around the Vietnam War, you had a crisis of legitimacy in the government. You had the movements for change. You had the pacifist ideals, but still, there was so much inertia in the system, you still couldn't really get it to change. So this is not like a magic formula. It's just a kind of, as I said, a kind of a patterning one sees.
Thank you. I am prioritizing the students just initially. Don't worry, I will get. Yes.
So I am one of the organisers for a radical climate direct action campaign in Exeter. And we are doing a series of protests around both Exeter in February and March, and in April as part of a coordinated campaign in London. If you, Roman, or anyone else would like to join, just speak to me afterwards, and I can sign you up.
Okay, a shout out.
I actually just did an event with some of the organisers of the April event a few days ago. So yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. This talk was really interesting. I wanted to ask you a point before about something you say about not only the untrustedness of that voters have towards politicians, but the fear that a lot of politicians have towards their voter base, that they have to deliver on something within 4 years. And if they don't, then they might lose their voter base and quick do something short term. Do you think that fear is overstated, or do you think it's genuine? And then secondly, the point about slavery was interesting. However, slavery is the same size as back in those days. It seemed to be an export of the private industry instead. So if there was something like Germans, they were voting against if there are 20 different companies involved, which are owned by 2 companies and some companies. Like how the world is going on. So do you think that there is genuine fear about doing anything to escape from? Do you think that change can sometimes be overstated, and what is necessarily an elevation of harmful behaviors?
Yeah, okay. People online didn't hear the question. Okay, well, I'll try and include some of it. So just on the sort of general question about, did slavery really end, in a sense? I think it's really important to recognize the enormous continuities after the 1830s. Partly I mentioned, you know, the apprenticeship schemes, but of course, you know, slave economies continued in many kinds of ways, whether it's through debt bondage, you know, which is still all around the world today, and other forms of enslavement which exist, and labor exploitation, and all those things. I still would say, though, that the 1833 Act made a difference to people's lives. And I think there's currently an underplaying of that in some of the literature around this. And I think it's just, you know, if you go back, you know, if you could go back and do oral histories of in the 1850s, I think you'd probably find that those who were in slave plantations in the 1820s would recognize that their lives were different by the 1850s. And there were shifts then, but of course there were all sorts of important continuities as well. But you know, I'm not someone who has a kind of a linear view of and rosy view of progress. You know, Steven Pinker's writings drive me insane. But I do think that there have been certain kinds of shifts in human history. You know, we don't hang, draw, and quarter people for you know, low-level crimes like we did in the 18th century in Europe. So I think there have been shifts. So I'm not wanting to paint too much of a rosy picture of that. In terms of the question about the politics and the fear and the short-termism, I mean, lots of things I could say about this. I gave a speech recently to the Dutch Senate. And one of the things I was saying to them was that, and I was speaking to politicians from across the political spectrum, and of course the Netherlands has just had basically a far-right government come in. I was talking to them about future generations and why they should be adopting something like they have in Wales, which is you might know that Wales has a Future Generations Commissioner under the Wellbeing Future Generations Act of 2015. Now, the commissioner in Wales doesn't have a hell of a lot of power, right? It's kind of a soft power. But that model of having a public position, in that case, a non-party position, which has a mandate to look at the impacts of legislation up to 30 years ahead in all areas, environment, healthcare, transport, employment, education, I think has been having a positive effect. I think it's a bridge institution to a sort of a deeper form of integrating the interest of future generations into today's politics. It's not super duper effective, but it's not bad. And there are other ways of doing that. You know, like in many countries, there are movements, legal movements to enshrine the rights of future generations into constitutions, right? In the US, at the state level and the federal level, big win in Montana last year around this, in Germany and other places. And I think these kinds of redesigns are ways of, what I was trying to say to the Dutch senators, I was trying to reduce their fear of how, you know, I was trying to say, look, it's one, or try and reduce the sense that they feel they have to just respond to the short-term interests of their electorates. Because they feel that as a real thing they must be doing. And partly what I was kind of saying to them is, look, you've all got children, most of you, or a lot of you, and you've probably got grandchildren. They're going to be around in the year 2100. You know, if you had something like a Future Generations Commissioner in the Netherlands, or citizens' assemblies replacing the Senate, I think that would be a pretty good idea. And it was, you know, just the beginning of a conversation, and it was a difficult one because, of course, for them, they are thinking about the elections and the opinion polls, and they do have a fear that or a sense they need to respond to their community's immediate needs. But actually, just finally on this, I remember asking the last Future Generations Commissioner of Wales, Sophie Howe, you know, how do you deal with this sort of tension between having to respond to your voters today and having to act for future generations? And the thing that she said, the most obvious thing she said was, look, the first thing I try and do is just find those policies which overlap, which, you know, are wins for both current and future generations. So, you know, things like green public transport, an obvious one, helps people today, helps people tomorrow. It's a kind of no-brainer. But of course, it doesn't mean there are no tensions between the present and the future. So that's partly where I kind of go and respond to that.
How many questions do we have online, if I may ask?
4.
Are you able to curate one?
Yes.
Sorry, we'll
Let's have it.
well then.
How do you think we should balance learning from history versus wanting to return to the past?
Okay, so how balance learning from history to wanting to return to the past? So I think the thing about learning lessons from history is, you know, every politician wants to use and abuse history, and they always have. Whether it's Stalin, you know, wiping out Trotsky from photographs, or today's regime in China not wanting their citizens to know about Tiananmen Square when they go on a large language model. And, you know, many politicians, of course, have rosy depictions of the past, like Boris Johnson during the Brexit campaign, about sort of a wonderful colonial nostalgia where there are no immigrants and there never were, and that kind of thing. So I reckon, you know, I mean, I think one always has to recognize that history can be romanticized and used and abused. I've tried not to do that in my book. And how have I tried not to do that? Well, just to give you a bit of a sort of example, what I did in terms of how I chose my cases that I looked at, rather than trying to have nostalgic depictions of colonialism and so on as what would guide the lessons from the past that I would draw on. What I did is I started with these 10 issues down the side, right? And I sourced those 10 issues from reading the literature on existential risk, civilizational collapse, global surveys of risk, all that kind of stuff. You know, I chose 10. There could have been 11. There could have been 7. Okay, so of course there's always subjectivity. Then I asked myself, okay, which bits of history from the last 1,000 years? And by the way, I didn't go back much further than 1,000 years, partly because my brain just couldn't go that far, my knowledge couldn't stretch that far, partly because the records start becoming a bit thin, particularly outside Western Europe, pre the year 1000. So then I asked myself, where can we find historical examples which can inform us about these 10 issues? But then I asked myself, where can we find historical examples which are not just negative lessons, the warnings from history, but the positive lessons from history? So that eliminated certain cases. And then I asked myself, because this book is based on a drawing on a certain kind of history, which is basically history from below, a kind of a movement that emerged in historiography after the Second World War amongst Marxist historians, oral historians, the French Annales movement, the idea that when we think about history, let's not just look at the actions of leaders, politicians, military leaders, the sort of the great man of history from Thomas Carlyle in the 19th century, but let's look at how communities and movements, people have about collective agency. So I've been looking for examples where collective agency has been particularly important, and then try to find examples where there's deep scholarship on these issues, right? And also try to pick out examples where there's large scale. So in my last book, The Good Ancestor, I wrote quite a lot about indigenous cultures and attitudes to long-term thinking. For example, Native American ideas of 7th generation decision-making, which I think are absolutely important and vital. But in writing this book, I thought to myself, well, I want to just, you know, not just look at some relatively like small-scale communities that have had very different forms of politics or economy, but let's try and find the large-scale examples where possible. So Edo, Japan is one example of that, a circular economy over 1 million people. I could have picked other examples too. So when it comes to large-scale circular economies in history, there's a brilliant paper by a native Hawaiian scholar called Kamana Bima on what he calls the ancestral circular economy in pre-colonial Hawaii before 1810. It's really exceptional and I think really important paper. I can't remember what journal it's in, but if you look up ancestral circular economy in Beamer, B-E-A-M-E-R, if you're into this stuff, have a look at that. And so there's selection. Of course, I haven't included everything I wanted. So there is always subjectivity in historical analysis. But like there's subjectivity in economic analysis and political analysis. Like when I used to try and measure how democratic countries were, that's what I used to do in part of my political science work, we were always making choices about which indicators we use over which time periods and which geographies and so on, right? There is no neutrality. We know this. And I think what I've been doing here is no different. But this is how I've tried to avoid the trap of a kind of a rosy romanticism. Try to be, I think of it as systematic cherry picking of history.
We call them systematic reviews. Yes.
Systematic reviews, yes.
I'm afraid our journey over 1,000 years has come to an end because we have run out of time. However, the good news is that Roman is around. The book is available, signed copies, but also if you just want to come and hang out, have a chat, there is going to be dinner at Herbie 6:30. Come see Rafi and me if you would like to join us. But other than that, I think what remains for me to do is to say thank you, Roman. That was great.
Oh, thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.